Hey folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Joining us today are Drs. Stephen Trout and Ian Isherwood, here to discuss their recently edited book titled Serpents of War, an American officer's story of World War I combat and captivity. The author of the book was one Harry Dravo Parkin, who was a major in the 316th Infantry Regiment of the 79th Division of the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I. He was awarded the Army Distinguished Service Cross. This past spring, I had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with Dr. Trout at the Society for Military History Conference in Washington, D.C. He was very gracious and kind, and it was a pleasure to speak with him about the podcast and World War I in general. I'm excited to have him and Dr. Isherwood come on the show. Dr. Stephen Trout is a native of Kansas City, Missouri. Dr. Trout joined the UA English Department in 2020, following appointments at the University of South Alabama and Fort Hays State University. His interdisciplinary research focuses primarily on the cultural representation of war in literature, visual art, and public monuments. He is the author of 3 books: The Vietnam Veterans Memorial at Angel Fire, War, Remembrance, and an American Tragedy, 2020. On the Battlefield of Memory, The First World War and American Remembrance, 1919 through 1941, 2010. And Memorial Fictions, Willa Cather and the First World War, 2002. And the editor or co-editor of multiple volumes, including Portraits of Remembrance, Painting Memory in the First World War, 2020, World War I in American Fiction, an Anthology of Short Stories, 2014, and War plus Ink, New Perspectives on Ernest Hemingway's Early Life and Writings, 2013. His articles have appeared in a wide variety of journals, including the Hemingway Review, Midwestern Miscellany, American Literary Realism, Studies in Short Fiction, War, Literature, and the Arts, and 20th Century Literature. Trout edits the book War, Memory, and Culture for the University of Alabama Press and is the recipient of the 2017 Mid-America Award for Distinguished Contributions to the Study of Midwestern Literature, an honor bestowed by the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature. Dr. Ian Isherwood is Associate Professor of War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College in the Interdisciplinary Studies Department and an affiliate in the History Department. Most of his scholarly work considers the experience of war and representation in the era of the 2 world wars. Having taught at a college on a famous battlefield for the past 13 years, Isherwood is also interested in the American Civil War and the connections between that conflict and broader concepts of historical memory in America. Isherwood is the author of Remembering the Great War, 2017, co-editor of Serpents of War, 2023, and The Battalion, Citizen Soldiers at War on the Western Front, 2024, which we will discuss in a separate episode. He has also written numerous journal articles and reviews. He is currently working on a book concerning the politics of commemoration from the Civil War to the Global War on Terror, tentatively titled Remembering America's Wars. Isherwood is a graduate of Gettysburg College, Dartmouth College, and the University of Glasgow, the latter where he did his PhD in history at the Scottish Centre for War Studies. He is a fellow of the International Society for First World War Studies, a member of the Society for Military History, and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. During the academic year 2022 to 2023, Isherwood was honored to serve as the Harold K. Johnson Chair of Military History at the United States Army War College. In 2023, he was a summer fellow in residence at the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. I do not have a source for this, but I do have proof in the video version of this podcast. I have read and I have now seen and can confirm that Dr. Isherwood is the, quote, best coiffed man on the internet, end quote. I'll stand by that, and whoever wrote it. We move on now to the book Serpents of War. Here is a description of the book from the Kansas Press website. Serpents of War, the memoir of Pennsylvanian Major Harry Dravo Parkin, is a rare account of World War I as seen from the perspective of a battalion commander. As a mid-level officer responsible for the lives and welfare of over 1,000 men, Parkin conveys the stress of command at a time when one innocent blunder could cost an officer his combat assignment, brings the inferno of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive to life in terrifying, gory detail, and recounts being taken prisoner by the Imperial German Army, a rare experience among American soldiers in 1918. In addition, Parkin provides a detailed account of the 79th Division's attack on Mountfaucon, a military action that remains controversial to this day. This is a book by a brave soldier, a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism on the battlefield, and a gifted writer. Serpents of War is an abridged edition of a nearly 200,000-word World War I memoir that resides in Gettysburg College's Musselman Library, enhanced by the contributions of two scholars of World War I and memory. Written in an unassuming but eloquent style, Parkin's narrative seldom strains for effect. It possesses a strong sense of setting, a knack for capturing the chaos and strange exhilaration of battle, and a sharp eye for the interpersonal, social dynamics of military life, the personality clashes and simmering feuds, as well as the moments of comradeship and accord. Serpents of War is an absorbing memoir that holds the reader's attention from beginning to end. When we discussed talking about Serpents of War, Dr. Trout wrote that it would be a book that would be hard to put down. I am happy to say that he was not wrong. This has been an excellent book, and I was so happy that I could facilitate this conversation with Drs. Trout and Isherwood. I think you're going to enjoy the book. Go ahead and get a copy. You won't be disappointed, and I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation that follows. All right. So, Drs. Trout and Isherwood, welcome to the podcast. And thank you so much for taking time to come on this afternoon/evening for yourself, Dr. Isherwood. You're over in the UK.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. So we'll just get right into the questions here. You have both worked on First World War history. What sparked your interest in the Great War? And I'll let you guys choose who wants to speak first.
Steve, why don't you go first?
Okay. Well, I actually can tie my interest in the First World War to a very specific moment. I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and my father was a ninth grade social studies teacher. And so he would come home from work, and you couldn't really interact with him for the first couple hours or so because his nervous system was completely worn out by those ninth graders. This was my first introduction to shell shock as a concept. But once he finally emerged, out from behind his copy of the Kansas City Star. I grew up in Kansas City, and you could actually speak with him. He would tell my mother and my brother and myself about what he had taught during that day in class. And I will never forget the evening when he described the unit that he was teaching on World War I. And the thing that really captured my imagination, and I think still does, was his description of this network of trenches that stretched all the way from the North Sea to the Swiss border, approximately 400 miles worth of trenches. And in my childish imagination, I thought, well, they must have all been connected. And a guy could enter a trench, in Belgium, up by the North Sea coast, and remain entirely underground then for this 400-mile journey, and then eventually emerge at the Swiss border. And of course, we know that the trenches didn't work that way. There were gaps in them, and so forth. But just this idea of Europe divided by these fortifications just grabbed me, and I think it has ever since. So that's the moment when I became interested in World War I, and I've never really been interested in anything else since. So.
Yeah, mine is it's a little similar, but also a little bit different than Steve's. I think I was always interested in history, and then I was really into Civil War history. And then when I was 16, I discovered, and Steve will appreciate this with his line of work. I discovered the author Ernest Hemingway through reading A Farewell to Arms, and I was, a romantic young 16-year-old who read this book that has to do with love and war and tragedy and all of it.
Same.
And yeah, and so I read that book, and it just blew my mind. And it got me going down a rabbit hole of looking into the First World War. And then I got to college 2 years later, and I picked up what I would consider my first serious work of literary scholarship, or maybe history. Steve and I are working on this subject right now, but I picked up Paul Fussell's The Great War in Modern Memory. And I read that book when I was 18, and it blew my mind because it really showed me that cultural history, or the idea of like looking for a big idea from the past that you could read through literature, that was something a person could actually do. So it wasn't just that history was a bunch of facts and dates and things like that, but that history had this cultural resonance to it. And so those kind of two books really, really changed my life. And then when I was looking for a reason to go back to graduate school, war literature seemed to be the way for me. I don't think I was clever enough to be a literary scholar, but I think I've done okay as a historian.
You had too much integrity to be a literary scholar, I think. I might just add that people often ask me, given my discovery of the First World War through my father's teaching and my deep interest in history, why I wound up in English studies and became an English professor. And you'll love this, Ian. Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms is one of the reasons. Huh. There were 3 books that I read as an undergraduate when I still was planning to go into communication as my field of study and ultimately work in broadcasting. One of them was A Farewell to Arms. The other was Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Mm-hmm. And the third was Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. And once I read those 3 books, I never had any doubt about majoring in English and ultimately going on for a doctorate in that field. So, you and I have known each other for years. We've collaborated on all kinds of projects. I've never heard your story before. Yeah. How you came into this interest. I don't think I've ever shared mine. So this is great.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. So it's funny because I read Paul Fussell's book probably a couple of years ago. Yeah. And I was also pretty impressed by it. I listened to an audio version of it commuting to work. Huh. But now I've come across like a lot of criticism of it that, there's a whole lot of problems with it. Which that sounds great. Good. Farewell to Arms. It's so funny. You bringing up Farewell to Arms, Dr. Isherwood, like I also read it when I was like 16, and I remember being like, wow, man, this is a really sappy love story. And it's actually like those words actually popped up into my head just now, like sappy love story. And that's how I like categorized it. But now it's been almost 3 decades since I read it. It's like, all right, it's definitely time to revisit A Farewell to Arms and see what what you take of it now. So
I strongly recommend it.
And you're bringing it up as well, and that helped you become a literature professor. So definitely that's going next on the list here. So fantastic. Dr. Trout, you talk a lot about cultural representation of war and literature and everything, and it's like when you get a red Volkswagen, you start seeing red Volkswagens everywhere. But I wonder if you gentlemen, before we get into the book, I see World War I everywhere. Up here in the Northeast, where I live, there's monuments everywhere that a lot of people don't even remember what they're about, but they're monuments to to World War One, or guys, men and women who served in World War One. But then also, like, even in I even look at like TV shows like The Walking Dead, and I'm like, that goes back to like World War One, like mass death and like kind of like this end of the world, and so I guess the good thing is I've learned to like not bring it up with the family, because they're like, yeah.
So have we.
Yeah, but yeah. So I wonder if you gentlemen see that as well, like in your work and then in the world of around you and media and everything.
I'll let Ian address that one first.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's par for the course. I think whenever you see like a purgatorial landscape and how it's represented in cinema, a lot of that goes back to early cinema and First World War, and certainly the tropes that you see with a lot of war films had their first incarnation in World War One books and World War One cinema. It kind of set kind of the genre of the war film and the war book as to what it would look like for both of the world wars. Just two little things, it's Thanksgiving, and Christmas comes with the Peanuts movies, the Snoopy movies, and I always tell people that Snoopy's the best advertisement for getting into World War One history that you could ever imagine, because not only is he a war hero, but he's one of the elite war heroes, right? He's a fighter pilot. Right. Who then goes off and then he becomes a novelist afterward. So he is your stereotype of your World War One pilot. So yeah, you see things like that, and you look at it, and they're kind of fun to think about. But then so one little thing I was thinking about was I was watching, and Steve will laugh at me for this. So I was watching at PBS a rerun of the Lawrence Welk show right before we came over to the UK. And so I'm watching it. I was watching all these older people dancing in the late 1960s or early 1970s at the Lawrence Welk show. And I was looking out at them. And I thought to myself, there's probably a bunch of doughboys out there in the crowd, because they would have been the exact age, right? And so you look at something like that, and you remember that within living memory, there were World War One vets that were still with us. I mean, I'm 46 years old, and I remember as a kid there were still World War One vets around, and so it's not that far away, but it is, of course, that far away.
Yeah. Well, and I'm 61, so I have vivid memories of World War One veterans I met as a child and as an adolescent. Well, my journey into the study of America in the First World War is I think if I address that will be a way of responding to your question, because once I decided as a graduate student in literature that I was going to work on the First World War, I did what a lot of people did. I decided to focus on the British experience, and reading Fussel's The Great War in Modern Memory was a big moment for me, as it is for so many people. And I really became fascinated by the British cultural response to the war. And in fact, I wound up writing my doctoral dissertation on that subject. But I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Missouri is home to the Liberty Memorial, which is the largest, most elaborate First World War memorial in the entire nation. And my dad would take me down there when I was a kid. I was always aware that Kansas City was the home of this incredible commemorative edifice. And I started to realize, sort of working out from the Liberty Memorial, that World War I commemoration in one form or another was everywhere in the American landscape. And absolutely no one was talking about it. When I decided to shift into working on First World War American literature, cultural representations of the war more broadly in American visual art, in American memorials, etc., hardly anyone was doing any work on that subject. Everyone was gravitating toward the British cultural response to the war. So it was the realization that there's this ubiquitous cultural entity, and no one is addressing it, that really led me, I think, to work on the American response.
And just to put a plug in for Steve, if listeners haven't listened or read Steve's On the Battlefield of Memory, it's a fantastic book about American responses and American memory of the First World War. It's a foundational text, Steve. So that's one of those that it's really important for people to read.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that assessment.
Love it. All right. Well, this is perfect. So, Dr. Trout, as you focused on the American experience in World War I, so we're here to talk today about the book Serpents of War.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's start with the main character and the main force behind that book happening, who is Harry Parkin. Can you tell us a little bit about Harry Dravo Parkin and how his manuscript was discovered?
Let me allow Ian to respond to that one first, because Ian actually has some connections with Parkin and with the Pittsburgh background.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So the manuscript it is in Gettysburg College, so it's in special collections at Gettysburg College, and I was aware that it was there, and it comes in 5 bound volumes, so it's a big manuscript, and so I was aware it was there, and I was aware also that there was this strange book collection that was tied to the manuscript. So literally, when you were in the stacks looking for war memoirs in the Gettysburg College Library, Musselman Library, there were over 300 war memoirs that were actually in the stacks, first edition war memoirs, that all of them in the inside of the war memoir had Harry Dravo Parkin's book plate inside of it. And his book plate, it's inside of Serpents of War, but it's really unique because it has his Distinguished Service Cross that's there in the book plate, has the regimental number, identifies him as a major, right? It's a really cool piece of material culture. So when I was doing my PhD, I was adjuncting at Gettysburg, and I was using some of these memoirs for my PhD. And as I was going through them, I noticed that Parkin was annotating a lot of these books with pencil marks, and he was... so I went up to special collections, and I realized that the manuscript was up there. But this was back in 2010, 2011. So I was working on a bunch of other projects. And then Bill Walker came along, William Walker, and he wrote a book called Betrayal at Little Gibraltar, in which he used Parkin's memoir as part of that book and a significant part of the evidence of the argument of that book. So I had dinner with Bill Walker. I think it was right after the book came out, and I mentioned to him that I leafed through the Parkin memoir, and I thought it was pretty well written. What would he think if I took it on as an editing project? And he seemed to think there was a lot of merit to that. So again, I was working on a bunch of other things, and lo and behold, Steve Trout and I met each other, and Steve had a lot of experience in editing World War I memoirs. We met at a conference in Aberdeen, Scotland. And then I invited Steve up to speak at Gettysburg College, and I wanted to get his expert eyes on the manuscript to see what he thought of it. So Steve came up, he leafed through it, gave it a really good read. Steve, you can kind of take it from there.
Well, I was instantly impressed by it. Amy Lucadamo, one of the special collections librarians, went ahead and sent me a scanned copy of the entire thing. And I just sat down and I read every word of it. And by the time I finished, I had absolutely no doubt that this was a major account. And I also felt that Ian and I would be the perfect two people to edit it together. That he would bring the perspective of a military historian, and I would bring my experience thinking about and writing about personal eyewitness accounts of war, a subject that's long fascinated me. And so that's what we did. And, we worked on this book together. Ian, it was something like 3 years, wasn't it?
3 years, yeah.
Yeah. It required a lot of work. The manuscript in its original form was unpublishable. Mm-hmm. Not because Parkin was a poor writer. Actually, I think Parkin was quite a gifted writer. The problem, though, is that for whatever reason, and the alcoholism that he suffered from later in life may have contributed to this. He repeated himself as he worked on this project. He would introduce another officer, maybe share some anecdotes about that individual. And then, 50, 60 pages later, he would reintroduce that character, perhaps with the same anecdote. It's possible that the 5-volume format of the memoir, that may have contributed to some of this confusion as well. He may have worked on these volumes individually, may have forgotten what he had already covered. So we realized as we started going through it that it was going to need a fair amount of editing. There were also lengthy digressions that Ian and I personally found fascinating, but that really detracted from the forcefulness of the narrative, that really interrupted the flow of experience that Parkin is presenting us with. So it took a long time to get the manuscript into shape. The chapter organization was often quite eccentric. You would have a chapter that was 70, 80 pages long, followed by one that's maybe 20 or 30. Really? So we decided to introduce some of our own chapter breaks. And that meant, of course, that we had to come up with some new chapter titles. And so ultimately, it's Parkin's account. It's his book. But it also, on some level, is a collaborative enterprise. I think we brought our own taste, we brought our own backgrounds to it, and contributed to the manuscript in that way. I wrote most of the introduction, and it turned out to be a very long and detailed introduction. That took me quite a while. I was a department chair while I was doing all of this. This was in the midst of the COVID pandemic. My department was imploding. This was my salvation every night, going home and working on Parkin's manuscript. So I contributed to the project in that way. And then Ian really had, I think, the most tedious task of going through and annotating the historical references in the text. And I think, and I've said this to Ian many times, that I think he did it just exactly right. There are enough annotations to help a reader who may be unfamiliar with some of the place names, the terminology, the military actions, but Ian didn't overdo it. So you don't feel bogged down with a lot of contextual information as you read the account. But as you can probably gather from my comments here, this was an elaborate project. Yeah. I think it took each of us as long as a monograph would have, actually.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and I often tell students when I talk about scholarly editing, which is something that is seldom discussed in most graduate programs and really should be, that if you edit the right work, this task can be every bit as rewarding as publishing your own book. And I think Ian and I both felt a tremendous sense of satisfaction when this book came out, that we had taken this relatively obscure account that very few people had read, but that we both instantly recognized as being historically significant and also captivating in a literary way. And we're able to get it out in front of the public.
Yeah, and it really, I can't underscore that enough and say that it came along also at the right time for us. So we first got the manuscript and got it approved, I think, by Kansas in the fall of 2019. And then, of course, the world shut down. So this became a COVID project, which we could work on because we didn't have access to archives. We didn't have access to a lot of the things we would need for our normal research, but we did have access to the memoir. We were able to establish contact with other scholars to give us kind of tips or ideas with things. And so it came along at the right time for us. And I think that one of the things that Steve and I offered to Parkin's work was that we had read all of the same books, or most of the same books that Parkin had read before and during he was writing his own book. So his manuscript happened to find its hands into two scholars who knew an awful lot about the same war literature in which he read, and that was his inspiration for writing his book.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, I think that Steve and I, who've both researched and written about the publishing industry in both the U.S. and in Britain during the First World War and afterward, one of the things, I'm not sure if this is true with you, Steve, but I was approaching this kind of like we were two interwar editors kind of taking this massive text and actually making a really functional war book out of it.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to think about Parkin's intended audience because I think this shifts at various points in the narrative, and I think ultimately it's a bit ambiguous. there are several places where he explicitly says, I am writing this memoir so that my son, Harry Parkin Jr., who was 9 years old when Parkin was commanding this battalion in France, I'm doing this so that my son will understand what I experienced. And when he's old enough to process this memoir, he'll know what I went through. Okay. But then there are other places where he seems to hint that it wouldn't be such a bad thing if this were published. And there's even one moment that I think it gave both of us chills, where he remarks parenthetically that I hope that the editors of this memoir in the future will consider the following. and suddenly Ian and I realized, oh my God, he's addressing us from beyond the grave. We are the editors working on this. It was a great moment. One other thing I wanted to mention real quickly in terms of Ian's qualifications for this project. I think it's important to note that not only is Ian at Gettysburg College, so he's at the institution that Alice Dangerfield Parkin, Harry Parkin's widow, gave the memoir to in 1950, and he's a historian of the First World War. Ian is also a Pittsburgher. And I think this was important because he knew the city that Harry Dravo Parkin came from. And, Ian, you had insights into the social class system in present day Pittsburgh, and also what that would have looked like in the 1910s. You were familiar with the Shadyside Academy, the exclusive preparatory school that Parkin attended there. Mm-hmm. So I thought that you brought you actually tracked down the Parkin home in Pittsburgh.
Really?
Which we featured as an illustration. So I felt that Ian had a lot to bring to the project beyond his academic qualifications and his position at Gettysburg. I felt he had some unique insights into Parkin because of where Ian is from.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Steve. It was one of those things that it was great being able to drive around Pittsburgh and look for Parkin things there. And also, it was also good to be able to put a lot of what I thought was useless Pittsburgh trivia to kind of good use.
Right.
A lot of, are there still a lot of traces, are there still traces of Parkin's world in Pittsburgh today?
So not as much. So Parkin's family, they were in the steel industry, and as pretty much everyone was there in the steel industry, really is pretty non-existent in Pittsburgh now. But the class system that he grew up with was still intact when I was kind of growing up, and that there were, like, for example, his family belonged to the Duquesne Club, which is the premier club for gentlemen in Pittsburgh, for gentlemen businessmen. And that's a club that he knew, his father knew, and is still a club for kind of the Pittsburgh elite. So that kind of world still exists a little bit in Pittsburgh, but it's not the same world as the kind of the late Victorian world in which he grew up in. But his house is still there. Shadyside is still a very nice place to live, and so you can see traces of the world in which Parkin lived in. Amazing.
Mm-hmm. I can't remember the source right now, but I've read somewhere that another historian wrote that the American AEF officer material, American Expeditionary Force, like the men who made up a lot of the officers, were probably of the highest quality that has been seen throughout America's history, or very close to it, because a lot of these guys, they were like Harry Parkin. They were college educated. They were the elites, and there's if you look at the fighter pilots, I mean, many of them, they were like Harvard grads. A lot of the ambulance drivers, they were all Harvard grads who shipped themselves over to France to volunteer for the French army and to drive ambulances, fly planes, and fight as members of the Foreign Legion. And then a lot of these officers, like Parkin is one, like these guys were, they were not working class. Like these were well-to-do men, and just the sense of like Harry Parkin, like while he's very much a man of his time and a very opinionated man, which
he definitely is.
He must have been awesome to be around. But like I mean, he was a qualified man, like it qualified to become an officer, and certainly qualified to become a major, in my opinion. But also, like, you can tell that even though he didn't grow up a military man, he took to it like 100%. Like when it was like, all right, I'm gonna take part in this. I'm gonna become an officer, and I'm doing this. And he was all about it. Like, and he believed in what he was doing. So, he's I don't know. I find him a fascinating man of his time. Can anything you got you'd like to add to that, or to round that up?
Well, I think the quotation you're thinking of comes from Samuel Hines, and I believe it's from The Unsubstantial Heir, which is his study of American aviators in World War One.
Yeah.
And he makes the point, and I'll paraphrase it badly, but it's to the effect that if the United States had an aristocracy in 1917, which one could argue it did,
Yes,
it was represented by these young officers
that's it. Yes.
who served in the American Expeditionary Forces. I think some things about Parkin's life and some things about his military service seem almost inevitable. Because of his social background, he went to Harvard. This was just for a young man of this time, of this social background, of this level of affluence, you went to an Ivy League school. The fact that he goes to the Plattsburgh camp, he's part of the preparedness movement. Not unusual at all for a person of his social background. To go from that into the officer training program at Fort Niagara, again, there's kind of an inevitability to all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But some things are unique. Parkin was a good deal older than most other officers in the American Expeditionary Forces. He's 38 years old by the time he leads this battalion in France. This makes him an old man. He's surrounded by officers who are much younger than he is, who are mostly in their 20s. Also, Parkin had I think a distinctive and unique fascination with military history, with military memorabilia. He collected war relics, started as a child, did this throughout his life. So I think even apart from some of the inevitable sort of features of his transition here into an Ivy League school and then ultimately into officer training and so forth, I think there's Parkin's passionate interest in war, and I think a desire to experience something that he has studied, that he's only seen from a remove. So I certainly have the impression, and Ian, you can indicate whether you agree, that Parkin was just itching to get into World War I. He wanted a command position. He wanted to serve. He wanted to test his own bravery. And there's no question at all about his physical courage. I don't think he exaggerates this one bit in the narrative. He states at several points that he felt he had a responsibility to the enlisted men he commanded to take the same risk that they did. So he didn't seek out shelter and try to avoid enemy fire. If the men were exposed, then he was exposed. And one of the reasons why I don't doubt his account here is the casualty rate among the junior officers in his battalion, which is absolutely staggering. But by the time the 316th comes out of its 5-day ordeal in the Argonne, Parkin only has 5 officers left in his battalion. So clearly this ethos of I'm going to prove my manhood on the battlefield. I'm going to show what a real American officer is. I'm going to lead men effectively at whatever cost. This was ubiquitous among men of this social background and of this time and place. At least that's my impression.
Yeah, and it's such a great point, Steve. And it's, we tend to think of an aristocratic officer corps when we think of the British Army, right? So we think of the kind of the pre-Somme battle British Army junior officer leading from the front, kind of with a sense of doomed youth behind them. But the AEF also certainly had that same classist structure. It just wasn't as codified, I think, as the British system. All of the officers that Parkin is serving with, they all had elite educations. And that was one thing as I was doing the annotations. When he'd mentioned somebody dies, I'd go back and look. And sure enough, they went to a prep school. Sure enough, they went to Princeton. Sure enough, they're dad owned the major department store in this particular city or is involved in the steel industry. Like they all have the same kind of what I'd call an establishment background, right? But with that comes that essence of noblesse oblige, because they're going to prep schools where they're being taught about the idea of class. They're being taught about the idea of leadership, right? They're also playing a lot of team sports. And this is something in Parkin's book that, he doesn't explicitly talk about, but it is something that I think is certainly there, is that he gets this idea of comradeship from somewhere, right? He's getting this idea of how you lead, how you be a good captain of people. He's not necessarily getting that intuitively. He's getting it from the sports pitch. He's getting it from his social upbringing. He's getting it from a relatively classical education, or an education that's steeped in history. And so when he is kind of an older man, he does have something to prove. And Steve, when you were talking about the fact that, he goes off to Plattsburgh, one of the things that I like to kind of contrast is Parkin's family with my family in Pittsburgh around the same time, because my great-grandfather Isherwood was a 55-year-old coal miner. He couldn't take 3 months off in the summer to go to Plattsburgh to play war, right? Harry Parkin could. Harry Parkin had that social ability to be able to take time off of work to learn how to become an officer even before the U.S. enters the war. So with that kind of class, with his sense of obligation, came that sense that he was destined to lead. And so I think that when he makes it over to the Western Front, he does have something to prove. But he also, and as you know from reading his book, he is a person who is not lacking in self-confidence.
Not at all. Not at all. I would just add that I think there's a lot of Theodore Roosevelt in the background as well. Parkin is 18 years old when Roosevelt leads in the celebrated Battle of San Juan Hill, and Roosevelt was such an influence on this generation of young, affluent American men. They took very seriously this notion of the quote unquote strenuous life. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt, of course, sees his performance in battle in Cuba as the defining moment of his life. And so I think a lot of these ideas about courage, a lot of these ideas about the obligation on the part of the wealthy to serve their country in time of national emergency, I think a lot of these ideas come from Roosevelt, and in fact, Ian and I discovered that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a classmate of Parkin's at Harvard. So I think that's an important connection as well.
Wow, fascinating. So this kind of almost seems like a silly question here, but like we're already proving it here and talking about it. But what makes Serpents of War stand out, and what does it add to the American experience of World War One?
I would point to two things. First of all, it's a record that's been left behind by a battalion commander. Mm-hmm. This is a unique perspective, I think, among American First World War memoirs. I can't think of another example. And so this meant that Parkin was responsible for the lives and welfare of about 1,000 men. This was a major responsibility. And he worries constantly. And Parkin can be quite full of himself. He can come across in the narrative at times as being quite arrogant. But I also think he tries to be as honest as he can be in presenting his war experience. And one of the things that struck me when I first read the book was the number of times when Parkin admits that he's fearful that he's done something that's going to lead to his removal from his command. Mm-hmm. This is a constant source of anxiety for him, and these are often very innocent little errors. At one point he says, if you're supposed to get your battalion from point A to point B, and there's a fork in the road, and you don't know which way to go, and you don't have a map that can help you, and you go the wrong way, well, there goes your command. You're going to be sacked for this kind of stuff. And so I think that he's very honest about the burdens of this level of command. He's also he writes about it in a very fine-grained way. that will sound as if it's tedious when I describe it, but it isn't. He has a writerly way of making things interesting. I'm thinking here of the paperwork that he has to deal with, something that's seldom mentioned in most accounts written by junior officers in wartime, and Parkin brings it up all the time. There's this insane color-coded card system that he has to master, when completing personnel records that he's convinced will never be read and are completely unnecessary, but he'll get sacked if he doesn't, comply with the demand to keep up with the paperwork. So that kind of granular detail is really extraordinary, and it gives you, I think, a much more fleshed out sense of what an officer experienced on a daily basis than you get in many other accounts. And then the other thing I would add is that his account of what it was like to pass through those 5 days of battle. Mm-hmm. Starting on September 26th, with this suicide mission, essentially that the 79th Division is given. This ridiculous, impossible assignment of seizing Mountfaucon in a matter of hours, instead of the 2 days that it actually is going to take them. He really brings us to life in a way that is just at times terrifying to read. And I think it's one of the most detailed, one of the most vivid, and certainly one of the most convincing accounts of what it was like to be an American foot soldier in the deadliest battle that the United States has ever experienced. And so people often ask me, where can I get a really good account of what this would have been like for my great grandfather or my great uncle or whatever? And I point them to Serpents of War. Even though Parkin's viewing this from the battalion level, you're getting a sense of what this was like for everybody, the enlisted men as well as the officers. So I think in those two respects, his unique perspective as a battalion commander who writes, I think, with a great deal of welcome detail about this experience, and then his ability to write about combat in all of its strange contradictions. One scene I'll mention real quickly, and Ian will remember this. There's a moment when Parkin and his fellow officers are basically flat on their bellies in a field, and they're being shelled by the Germans. And one shell passes over their heads and it lands a few feet behind them. And because the ground is saturated with water, because this is northeastern France in September, it's absolutely miserable. It's cold. People are just soaked to the skin through this entire battle. Because it's so damp, the shell explodes and it doesn't harm anyone. It just flings these huge clods of dirt that pepper the backs of the officers as they're in this position. And they all break out with hysterical laughter. It seems like a very authentic moment, that in the midst of this stress of combat, something has just happened that's not really comical, but it seems that way at the moment, and everyone laughs and everyone gets a kick out of the expressions of fright that are on the faces of their fellow officers. Okay, so you read that, and then seconds later, a messenger from one of the companies that are advancing up ahead comes back to confer with Parkin on something, and the guy gets his brains blown out. A bullet passes through his helmet at the very moment that he's talking to Parkin. So you've got this just incomprehensible juxtaposition of something that's viewed at the time as being humorous, set right next to this moment of sudden horror. And there are lots of moments like that in Parkin's account. And I really think it brings to life the strangeness, the surreal quality of combat that so many veterans talk about. I think that's vividly illustrated.
Yeah, and I everything Steve said was perfect. And I think that I would add two other things. One is that you do get a sense also of profound loss that comes out of it as well, because Parkin Parkin develops a very close friendship with some of his NCOs and with some of the officers that are killed around him. And you can tell as he's writing this also, we talked about audience, he's also writing this as a memorial expression for some of those people. And the book gets at the heart of kind of the difficulty of a memoirist job, I think, a war memoirist job, which is trying to get at the reality of what they experienced while also trying to preserve something of the heroism of the men around them. And especially the 5 days of Mountfaucon. I mean, Parkin, I think, has a really amazing ability at writing about battle. A lot of memoirists really struggle with that. Parkin has vivid clarity, and I think in part it's because of his position as both a battalion commander, so he's not leading the platoons himself, but he's actually able to observe the moving parts that are around him. The second thing I'd add is that he was taken captive, and there aren't that many that I know of captivity narratives of American officers, especially a battalion commander. I'm not even sure if I can recollect one.
No, I don't know of any others.
Yeah, and so even though he's only captive for about a week, it still is a pretty unique account about his experience of traveling into Germany and then out of Germany after the war.
I was surprised that he was taken so far from the front line, like so quickly. And I was actually even surprised at his treatment. Like he speaks very, very highly of his treatment by the Germans, and in nowhere in his writing about that time in captivity does he really doesn't have anything bad to say about the Germans, other than their disintegrating military discipline, which he's just appalled by.
Right.
Understandable, but he's like. I found myself, like, when I was reading that part, I was like, does he just remember this with rose-tinted glasses here, or were the Germans like actually like this nice to him? And I would have to guess that he's the one who was there, so he would.
I think we make the point in the introduction that there's a hallucinatory quality to much of his account of his experiences as a POW. And I think that his mind and his body were under incredible strain during this captivity experience. He was wounded in both legs, and he seems too mobile in his description of what he's doing once he's taken prisoner. And then his account of the Germans. I have no reason to suspect that it isn't largely accurate, but two things about it I think are problematic. One, I question this universal respect and consideration that he receives from his German counterparts, from the officers in the Imperial German Army. May well have happened. It may well have happened exactly as Parkin describes it. That there may have been a social class recognition going on here between the well-educated counterparts in the Imperial German Army and men like Parkin. But it seems a bit exaggerated at times. And then the other thing I wondered about is Parkin just meets these German soldiers. Who speak English. It seems like 3/4 of the Imperial German Army is fluent in English, or 3/4 of the German Army consists of men who have relatives back in the United States, or who worked in the United States, or
they worked as waiters, like back in London or New York. Yeah,
yeah. So you wonder, if you put yourself in Parkin's shoes in that section of the memoir. He's gone from this position of command and authority now to one of complete helplessness. He's probably in a great deal of pain from these leg wounds. He doesn't know how the Germans are going to treat him. He doesn't know what's finally going to happen to him. And so I felt ironically that part of the memoir where he's out of the combat action seemed to me at times to be maybe the least reliable. On the other hand, when he's describing what it's like to pass through the Meuse-Argonne, I have much greater confidence in what he's telling us. And just a quick point about that. and to go back to Ian's observation about the nature of war memoirs and the issues pertaining to war memoirs that Parkin's own account presents, a lot of people who write about their personal experience in war will maintain that experience is ineffable. It cannot be put into language. It defies language. It is beyond language. Parkin never does this, which I think is very telling. Parkin's confident that he can find the language to describe this experience. And then to go back to Ian's point about the memorial function of the text, I think Parkin feels he has a responsibility to get the language right and to describe things, no matter how painful, as they happened in battle, because he owes this, in a sense, to the men who have died. So I think this is a unique thing about Parkin. And Ian, you can probably think of other examples as well of war memoirs where the memoirist sort of, throws up his hands and says, "Well, I really can't make sense of what happened next, or I can't really convey the full import of this particular situation." Parkin always feels like he has the resources at his command to effectively narrate something.
He does, and I'm hesitant to say this, but I will, even though this is being recorded. That historians are pretty. One of the things that we warn ourselves about doing is to try to get into the psychology of the person that we're trying to understand, right?
Right.
But there is something to the nature of traumatic memories that has played with me with Parkin, with the POW section versus the other sections, in that, Parkin is a creature of honor. He clearly is a very courageous man. He proves himself under fire in the first 2/3 of the book. But when he's wounded, I really think the narrative shifts.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason it's in kind of, as Steve would say, this kind of dreamlike sequence is because I think that kind of the traumatic reality of what his experience was, in two reasons, kind of came home. One, because he's physically not able to move and in a great deal of pain, or is too mobile for some reason, but he's in a great deal of pain, right? So he's dealing with the war wounds. But then the second reason is because he's completely inactive and doesn't have something to concentrate his mind on. When he's in battalion command, when he comes out of battle, he's immediately doing paperwork and writing letters and hyper-focusing on the million different tasks he has to do. Once he's on a stretcher, he's not doing that. So I think that there's something about trauma, there's something about decompression that's going on in that section. And I think the weirdness of that section is something you'd probably find in a lot of memoirs of people who've been wounded. And I've read a bunch of these, or people who are POWs, where they suddenly have time to process what's actually going on.
I think that's an excellent point. And you just need to come over to literary study. We'll hypothesize about people's psychological states, all day long. We're under no immediate pressure not to do so. So you're welcome.
Thanks, Steve.
We've any scene from the book that captures like the essence of who Harry Parkin was as a man and military officer for you?
I'll give you one that I think is the most powerful scene in the entire book. And I think it's a scene that haunted Parkin his entire life. After the 316th Infantry comes out of it goes through two ordeals in the Argonne.
Right.
Its first ordeal, which opens on September 26th. Parkin's battalion faces something like a 20-mile march, to get away from the front lines. They're sent to the Troyonne sector near Saint-Mihiel, and they're exhausted. They're exhausted. I mean, they've used up their adrenaline. They don't have anything left. They've been through 5 days of battle. They've had little to eat, little to drink. The weather is horrible. The influenza pandemic is raging. Everybody's sick. It's just a miserable bunch of men. And they march out of this battle. And even in the midst of all this misery, Parkin feels that he can still feel some level of pride, that these inexperienced citizen soldiers, who incidentally are miserably trained. They're completely unprepared for this ordeal that they experience. This becomes very clear in Parkin's memoir. He feels that they've acquitted themselves well. They've represented the great state of Pennsylvania and the other areas, that provided the soldiers for the 79th Division. They've done the best they could. And so they get down to the Troyonne sector, and the officers who are survived, and there are not very many of them, are summoned to a meeting. And it's a meeting that's led by their brigade commander, okay, by a general. And Parkin, thinks that they're going to be praised for their efforts in battle. And it's the exact opposite. And the brigade commander bawls them out, tells them they did a horrible job. They have disgraced themselves. Of course, this attitude starts with Pershing, who was, of course, furious because the 79th Division did not take Mountfaucon according to this ridiculous timetable.
Right.
That, as Edward Lengel remarks, was designed for an army of supermen. Yes. It would have been impossible for any army to make the kind of advance that Pershing wanted on the first day of the Meuse-Argonne. But this attitude that the 79th Division has let everybody down and has performed poorly in battle and is a discredit to the American Expeditionary Forces and to the nation as a large. This starts with Pershing, and then it trickles down to the survivors in the 79th Division. And Parkin is of course indignant, but more than that, I think he's furious, and perhaps even more than that, I think he's wounded. I think it's a wound that is as scarring to him in some respects as the literal physical wound that he'll receive later in the narrative. I think we remark in the introduction it was the bitterest moment in Harry Dravo Parkin's war experience. Maybe it was the bitterest moment in his entire life. And so I think that scene out of all of them is the one that really, really stays with you.
Yeah, and I would echo Steve. Steve said it perfectly. I mean, that scene is one that, it reminds me, it's just, in the way he writes it is absolutely beautiful, because he sets it up with such pride in his men and with such pride in his fellow officers, and watching them march out, these battered men. And one thing, just to add to Steve's point, Parkin's very good with anticipation. So when the 79th goes up the line, they don't have much of a briefing as to what they're supposed to do before they go up the line. They go up the line, they go into trenches, the preliminary bombardment begins, they're watching it with glee and excitement. They then go up over the top and they start the attack the next day. And when you contrast that anticipatory excitement with all of its bravado and courage with then the unexpected reprimand in which he receives, I agree with Steve 100%. Like, that's the impetus, part of the impetus for him, I think, writing the book. It certainly was the impetus for him then writing his affidavit and writing about the controversy at Mountfaucon that then Bill Walker was able to use in his book too. And Steve, there's also that notion of anticipation before the attack on Cornwallis Hill, when he's drinking with the French colonial officers when they're having their brandy and they're looking at their maps, right? It's a beautiful scene of these, two allied officers both together, sitting there in a dugout and planning what the next attack's going to look like. And you can tell that Parkin's excited about what's going to happen, right? And he writes about that sense of excitement.
He's excited, but he's also filled with dread.
Yeah.
Because he now knows what combat is like.
Yeah.
There's a moment in his account of those 5 days at the beginning of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne where Ian, you'll remember the scene. He runs into another officer who had served with a different unit through the summer battles that the AEF had fought, the Aisne-Marne campaign, and he says to this more experienced officer, well, you must be more comfortable with battle now because you've been through a number of them. And the guy says, no, it gets worse every time you go through it. For the first time you don't know what to expect. You're an innocent. And then once you know what to expect, it becomes almost unendurable to force oneself to do it again. And so Parkin goes into that second battle, that attack on Cornwallis Hill, which they'll launch on November 4th, 1918, complaining in the memoir that, wait a minute, we haven't really received any additional training. We haven't recovered from what we experienced at the beginning of this battle, and now they're going to send us in again. So you're right. There's still vestiges of that Parkin who's maybe a little bit of a war lover, who is, kind of high on this excitement and anticipating the battle. There are still vestiges of that. But there's also, I think, this new attitude that, oh, good Lord, they're surely not going to ask this of us again. And I think that's one of many moments I would point to in the text where I feel Parkin is being honest about his feelings at the time.
It's like a both and, like he's excited for combat, but he's also distinctly aware of, like, I remember him mentioning that, if we'd had machine guns, I could have held that hill rather than have the Germans take it back. Like, so he's aware of everything that can kill him all of a sudden, like
exactly.
And Steve and I have both been to both sites, and you really don't get the vastness and the difficulty of what they were called to do unless you're seeing the topography. And for both of those attacks, I mean, they both were. The first one especially was impossible with the timetable in which they were given, but even Cornwallis Hill is a really tall order to ask a battalion to take.
Yeah.
We, my friend and I, we take folks on tour to the Meuse-Argonne, usually during the summers. And we like to bring, there's a little wood just south of Mountfaucon. It's called Bois Bryce. And we take folks into it. It's a little square of wood, like maybe less than a kilometer square. But we take them in there, and then, we kind of turn them around, and then we walk out, and now we're, when you walk out facing north, you've got open fields, and then you've got the hill, and then you got the Mountfaucon Memorial now. And we're like, all right, so, that's what they were looking at, and that's what they were facing. And, these fields were getting plowed with artillery, soaked with gas, and you had to get across it, and take that hill right there. So it's very, there's nothing like standing there and seeing it in real life. Any descendants of Major Parkin who were involved in editing the manuscript at all, or participated?
Absolutely, and Ian should narrate this portion because he tracked down the descendant that we worked with.
Yeah, so I made contact with Bill Walker again, and Bill and I had an exchange and was able to get a phone number and an address, an email address for Parkin's grandson, Pete Parkin.
Wow.
And so I was able to make contact with him, and then Steve and I arranged a Zoom call with him. Again, it's during COVID, so everyone was Zooming. But what we didn't realize is that he still had a lot of his grandfather's stuff, including a scrapbook with some amazing photos in it of Parkin's service in the First World War, as well as some memorabilia and Parkin's pistol as well, which was there too. And so we talked to Pete about the photographs, and he very graciously sent them to Gettysburg College. Unfortunately, they'd been kept in pretty poor condition. I don't think necessarily by him, but by someone in the family. Mm-hmm. And so when we got them, they were pretty badly damaged. But my genius colleagues in Special Collections, Amy Lucadamo in particular, was able to work on the photographs and to get some of them to make them serviceable for then to publish within the book. So the published photographs within the book are coming out of Parkin's scrapbook. The annotations that are on them, some of them are his direct annotations in which he annotated within the actual scrapbook. So we were able to make contact with Pete Parkin. We were able to get those visual images, and that really added a richness to it. And I will say, Steve, in our conversation with Pete, he did give us quite a bit of good context, I think, for Parkin's life.
He did. In fact, the introduction to our book ends with some anecdotes that were shared by Pete Parkin, which are both, I think, just absolutely amazing. He had two especially vivid memories of his grandfather, and Pete was like 6 years old, if I remember correctly, when Major Parkin died. I don't remember much of anything at the time when I was 6 years old, but Pete has a very sharp memory, and there were two moments that stood out for him. One, he remembered being in his grandfather's upstairs study, in their home in Los Angeles. And I should point out that that Parkin and his wife and son leave the Pittsburgh area after World War I, and like a lot of entrepreneurs and investors and so forth, moved to Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And Parkin worked in the real estate business in Los Angeles. They had a home in L.A., and then they had a seaside cottage in the what's the name of the neighborhood, Ian?
It was Balboa, right?
Balboa. Yeah. And so that's where the Parkin family really remained for the rest of Major Parkin's life. And so Pete remembered going into the house in Los Angeles, spending time with his grandfather in the upstairs study. You have to visualize a study completely lined with military memorabilia, okay, because he was still collecting military artifacts, and Pete found all of this, curious and enchanting and so forth. But he would go up into the study and he would play World War I with his grandfather. And his grandfather would tell the story of, his experiences on Cornwallis Hill, and the grandfather and the grandson would duck down behind the desk, as if they were in a trench. And Major Parkin would tell his grandson, the Germans are coming and what. It's just an enchanting moment. This World War I veteran, who we know there's a dark side to all of this. We know that Parkin, felt survivor's guilt. We know he had issues with alcohol. There was a lot of baggage that he clearly carried as a result of his war experience. But at this moment, he was able to turn it into a kind of play. I think it's just an extraordinary moment. And then the other one is that on VJ Day, people are firing fireworks and shooting guns up in the air and so forth to celebrate. And Harry Parkin wanted to get his World War I service revolver and let fly with a few rounds to celebrate, but apparently he had not kept the weapon oiled, and it wouldn't operate. And so Pete vividly remembers his grandfather's profound disappointment that gosh, I wanted to fire this gun in the air to join in the VJ celebration, and it wouldn't operate. So I really love those two anecdotes. So Pete turned out to be a gold mine. And one other thing I should mention is that you never know how those kinds of exchanges are going to go.
Right.
Pete could easily have been a person who said, no, I do not want this memoir coming out. Leave my grandfather's memory alone. I don't know you people, go away.
Right.
And instead, he was just as generous and kind-hearted to us as he could possibly be. And that scrapbook turned out to be an absolute gold mine. Most, right, Ian? I think most, if not all, of the illustrations in Serpents of War are from that scrapbook. And Amy did a wonderful job of restoring them.
Yeah. No, I can't impress upon you how great my colleagues are at the college, because they were so supportive throughout this entire process, and how great Pete Parkin was in supporting the process too. So it was a joy to put this together, especially with a colleague that I actually like. So with Steve. So.
Dr. Trout, you were able to literally follow in Harry Parkin's footsteps this past summer. I will link to your article on it in the episode notes, but could you tell us just briefly what that was like? I think one of the pictures in the book of it's this barrel of linseed oil, I think, and you probably looked at the same barrel that he did, which I know it's a barrel, but I just find it fascinating.
Yeah, it probably contained boiled animal fat.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, which was used as a treatment for the hooves of horses and cattle.
Mm-hmm.
Now Ian has been to Mountfaucon as well, so we both have visited the battlefield that Parkin crossed during his first experience in the Meuse-Argonne. And also Ian has been to Cornwallis Hill, as have I. Because I had more time for my trip than Ian had, and Ian, you were leading students, you poor devil, were you not? Yeah. I was on my own in my French rental car doing whatever the hell I pleased for a week before my wife arrived. So I had the luxury of time. So I went to Mountfaucon. I tried to visualize the movement of Parkin's unit south of that hill when they were operating in support of the 313th Infantry, and then to visualize how they crossed that landscape once they were moved to the point of the spear, once they were leading the attack in that area north of Mountfaucon. But my favorite part of the trip, and the part that I found most interesting, was the time that I spent in Burgundy. So I wanted to visit the places where Parkin was posted during this period of about 6 weeks, when the 316th Infantry was being inadequately trained, but at least receiving some practice with target practice with rifles and so forth. And so I visited the town called Percy-le-Grand, which is where Parkin had his command post during this period before they went into battle. And then I was fascinated by this account that Parkin gives us. It takes up almost half a chapter. This account that he gives us of his visit to a medieval castle. And he meets the owner of the castle. And Parkin, we haven't mentioned this about him up to this point in the conversation, but Parkin was quite eccentric in some respects. He was an antiquarian. He was obsessed with the Middle Ages. He was a great admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes. His favorite book as a child was Ivanhoe. And so he has this opportunity to go through this medieval castle, and he describes it with childlike wonder in the narrative. My God, a real medieval castle. This is great. And so I was interested in seeing if I could find that castle. And so Ian, studied the maps carefully of the area, and we tried to figure out which one would be the most likely candidate. And we decided that it was a castle called the Commanderie de la Romaine, which conveniently turned out to be a bed and breakfast. So I stayed at the bed and breakfast and tried to figure out, am I in the castle that Parkin visited in 1918? And so I talked with the owner of the castle, and he had a son who was studying at the Sorbonne, who was fluent in English. And so he went through Parkin's account carefully. And so the first morning I was staying there, I came down and he said, I don't think that Parkin was here. This detail doesn't match, that detail doesn't match, and whatnot. But the next morning when I came down, he had studied it more carefully and discussed it with his son and decided, I think your Major Parkin was here. And we discovered, or we concluded, that the things in Parkin's account that don't match up with the actual family and with the actual castle were probably a result of translation problems. Okay. Parkin claimed that he spent this afternoon in the company of this French count who owned the castle. Well, the family that owns the castle today has been there for 200 years, and they're not aristocrats. They're middle-class people, but probably this got garbled in translation. The quote-unquote count in 1918 told Parkin that he had lost 2 sons in the First World War. This would have all been Parkin didn't speak a word of French, which is one of the things that makes his sort of, his fascination with French military history and his admiration for Napoleon so ironic. Parkin's kind of an insular American tourist through much of this experience. But anyway, he's told by the Count that the Count has 2 sons in the war, but it turns out that actually the man who was living in the castle at that time did have 2 sons in the war, but only one of them was killed. So, and there were other things I could go on about, but basically we concluded he was there, and these were matters of translation. So I found that just to be amazing. One of the breakthrough moments came when the current owner of the castle looked at that passage where Parkin says, I'm taken on this tour of these medieval battlements in this medieval fort, and I saw the barrels that contained the boiling oil that was poured on the enemy soldiers as they tried to storm, the front gate of the castle, and suddenly, the aha moment came, which was, wait a minute, there wouldn't be vats of oil left over from the Middle Ages that were used to defend the castle. This is ridiculous. So what was he looking at? He was looking at these vats that the family boiled animal fats in, because in the early 20th century, they were in this business of producing this substance for the treatment of animals. So it was just a lot of fun. I got to play detective for a few days and actually be in the space that Parkin was in France and see things that he saw. It was a magical moment.
And I will say it was magical on my end because Steve was giving me updates every day. So he'd say, the plot thickens, Ian.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was texting him constantly.
Yeah.
I think my excitement was
great.
evident in those texts.
That's awesome. I like that's something that I find magical. That you can be in France and you can text someone back in the States and be like I'm here like right now.
Yeah.
Well, I should add that this region of Burgundy, where the 316th was stationed for 6 weeks in 1918, is a time capsule. It looks exactly today the way it would have looked when Parkin was there. This is well outside the touristy areas of Burgundy. It's not in the wine country, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It's about probably 20 kilometers or so northeast of Dijon, and there's nothing there. There's a canal system that dates back to the 18th century. Parkin describes it in his account. It's still there. The villages look very much as they would have in 1918. So it was just an amazing experience.
That's fantastic. All right. So our final question here of the evening. Any other projects that we should be on the lookout for? Dr. Isherwood, I'm going to I don't know quite how to do it. So no, right there. So we have that you have one project just recently completed, and we'll be discussing the battalion here on the podcast in the next few weeks. But any other collaborations or any other ideas that you are willing to share? And it's okay if you're not.
What do you think, Steve?
Oh yeah, sure.
So Steve and I just finished another collaboration. Should we talk about that, Steve?
Yeah.
So we just finished an article for the Journal of Military History on Paul Fussel's Great War in Modern Memory at the age of 50. So we're re-examining that work in light of all of the people that love it, all of the people that loathe it, and trying to assess kind of what the lasting impact of that book has been on the field of First World War studies. And it was amazing to work with Steve again. I think we're natural collaborators to some degree.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun to work on that article.
Oh, I look forward to that. Oh, that's so cool.
And Steve, you're working on a book, right?
I am. I'm working on two of them. So I'm working on a book that focuses on the sinking of the SS Tuscania, which was a British vessel, but used as a troop ship to carry American soldiers to France. And it was torpedoed on February 5th, 1918. It went down in the North Channel that separates the northeastern tip of Ireland from the Hebrides. Right in the space of water that's between that corner of Ulster and the Isle of Islay, which is the southernmost isle in the Inner Hebrides. And more than 200 American servicemen died in this U-boat attack. And this was the largest loss of American life in a single military incident since the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. And so, as you can imagine, it was a traumatic national episode. It shook Americans up. It reminded them that the United States was in a real war. It was going to involve its cost in blood. There was no way out of this. And so there's never been a book focused entirely on this. And so my tentative title at this point is Remember the Tuscania. That was the big slogan at the time. Rather ironic because hardly anybody remembers the Tuscania today, other than Ian, who's heard me talk about it a dozen times. But the title is going to be Remember the Tuscania, History, Memory, and the deadliest U-boat attack on Americans in the First World War. And I'm about 3/4 of the way through that book. I plan to submit it to Cornell University Press, where I'll do that in February, where it will hopefully appear in a military history series edited by David Silby. And then the other book, which I plan to finish about the same time, is a collection of essays on cultural representations of African American war experience. And it contains 17 essays that deal with an incredible range of cultural artifacts, films, computer games, works of literature, music, you name it, all of which portray Black soldiers in the U.S. military, going all the way back to the Revolution and then up through the end of the 20th century. And I'm co-editing that with Jennifer James, who is an English professor at the George Washington University.
Wow. Yeah, fascinating. Well, I look forward to everything. And I hope, I know we've discussed this previously, but look forward to speaking as well about the SS Tuscania here.
All right.
When just as soon as we can work that out. Wow, this is fascinating. Drs. Trout, Dr. Isherwood, thank you so much for coming on. Dr. Isherwood, I know it's probably pretty late over in England, so thank you so much for taking time out of your evening.
I think he's holding up pretty well.
Yeah.
He's doing great. This has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about the book. And this was such a great conversation, and makes me look at the book like really. I'm just want to finish with in one of your emails, Dr. Trout, you said that you won't be able to put this book down, and it was as soon as I opened it, it was oh man, this is something different here. This is great.
Right.
It's a fantastic book.
Right.
So thank you, gentlemen, for coming on and look forward to speaking with you both again soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Mike.